Fabiano Caruana is in the news. A few days ago, he announced his intention to play for the United States team, switching from Italy, country he's represented over the past 10 years. And straight after that, he started play in the final FIDE Grand Prix tournament in Khanty-Mansiysk in Russia. And it hasn't seemed to have affected him. Let me take you through his round 3 game against Yevgeny Tomashevsky. It's a Slav. I'm going to go through these first few moves fairly quickly. This is the so-called Chebanenko variation, where black would like to advance with b5. Also sometimes stops a check on b5 in some variations. a4 from Caruana, obviously preventing b5, but there is a drawback to this move, that it leaves the b4 square weaker. So you can see a knight is ready to hop round to that square, and this can be a problem for white. But Caruana finds a very interesting new way to play this position. Previously, moves like bishop d3, bishop e2 and bishop d3 have been played, but I'm sure that black is okay in these variations. But g4 I really like from Caruana. This is a new move in this position. Of course, we've seen this kind of idea to advance on the king side in similar queen's pawn positions. Aronian, for example, has played it with exactly this structure in other Queen's Gambit variations. And indeed, Botvinnik was playing this kind of idea decades ago. But as I said, new in this particular position, and I rather like it here, because, as I said, black is doing fine on the queen side. That is a structural disadvantage. So what Caruana is doing is shifting play towards the king side and using his extra time to develop an initiative there and in the middle of the board. So let's see how this works in practice. First of all, I should say that if that pawn is taken, then rook g1 is a good response. Of course, once the knight retreats, then white takes on g7 and black's king side has been weakened. So Tomashevsky plays knight a6. Of course, it's a good move coming around to this square. And Caruana plows on with g5. The knight comes back. So you can already see that black's development is rather retarded now. Caruana continues with his kingside expansion. This is very nice, and white can get away with this because he has this very solid central pawn chain. Now it's time for some development. Bishop e2, and white continues again. And now clearly black would like to break open the centre with c5, or perhaps taking on c4 first. So Caruana closes the centre to a certain degree, or at least keeps this bishop rather bottled in behind the c and d pawns. Queen d2, preparing perhaps to castle on the queen side. Now Tomashevsky could castle here, but clearly he didn't want to have the uncertainty of what was going to happen with these pawns. Perhaps at some stage white would play h6, perhaps sometimes even g6. So instead he played f5. Now if this pawn remains here, it's going to be very difficult for white to break open the position. So Caruana exchanged. And now here's an interesting move. He played h6. Now this means that there probably isn't going to be an attack down the g-file, but when the position breaks open, of course, black's king is always going to be weaker, because, or weakened on the king side, because these diagonals are going to be open, and the h-pawn sets up potentially some mating nets, as we'll see in the game. Very consistent play by Caruana. I think you have to play like this if you're going to lock the position on the king side with h6. So what he's doing is he's breaking open the middle of the board. And again, this is totally consistent with his strategy with g4, basically playing in the middle and on the king side and making sure that black's strategic advantage on the queen side is balanced, or on the other side of the board. It's also playing very energetically and making sure that, well, he's using his lead in development actually as well. So I really like Caruana's play here. So he castles on the queen side, which at first glance looks pretty risky with, you know, these pawns here not the best, and this knight sort of dangling in the face of white's king. But because white controls the centre and, well, has very good coordination with his pieces, Caruana can get away with this only if he plays energetically, which he continued to do. Let's see what happened. Knight d5. Attacking the bishop drops back to g3. Bishop a6, okay, that would seem logical to exchange off this poor bishop. Having said that, it wastes more time because it's going to take black more time to bring this rook back into play. And just compare the two positions of the rooks. White beautifully coordinated, black's rooks split, and Tomashevsky now moved the rook back, but it's so time consuming. King b1, careful move. Before he breaks open, he's just making sure his king is a little bit safer. And I think this knight is also a problem for black. You can see it doesn't really have a move, and it just gets in the way. You know, at the moment, for example, it's very difficult for black to develop the queen successfully here. You can see these squares are controlled. This e7 is obviously very dubious because there's a rook there. And yeah, it's difficult for black to coordinate because of these two pieces stuck in the middle, breaking the communication between the rooks. This is a glorious piece on d5. But we'll see how Caruana deals with that in a second. Bishop e7. So the bishop drops back. Rook takes knight threatened. Bishop b4 threatened. So therefore queen d3 guards against both threats. The queen protecting the knight. Rook f5. And now we can see how Caruana is breaking, well, moving forward into the centre. He has a clear plan here. So, I mean, beautiful centralisation. This is really wonderful. And in combination with that pawn, this can be highly effective. So, first of all, this knight is looking at the pawn on c6, which of course protects the knight on d5. So he's looking to undermine black's central position. Of course, that knight could be taken. I dare say, well, bishop takes is possible. Pawn takes I rather like. You know, maybe that knight is going to throw itself into d6. Perhaps knight c3 as in the game, but clearly, you know, white is still making progress there. Queen c8, threatening, defending the pawn on c6. And here, this move I really like. Knight c3, as I mentioned a moment ago. This is really the only decent piece in black's position. So what does Caruana do? He tries to exchange it off. It's so logical. Also, this opens up the e-file, so you can see there are now threats starting to develop there. So one very simple threat is to exchange on d5 and play knight g6, uncovering an attack on the bishop. So love this play from Caruana. It's so energetic, so single-minded in his strategy. So black exchanged off this knight. There was, well, let me just go back a moment. Let's see what happens if black tries to hold things together with knight f6. I mean, this would seem positionally to be very logical. Problem is, queen c4 is really nasty, putting pressure on c6 and therefore indirectly on d5. And that pin is horrible. You can see, I mentioned earlier, that black's king is in permanent difficulty on the king side once white has played h6. There's no really good hiding place for it, because even if it goes into the corner, this diagonal is open. So very logical play. Knight takes, queen takes, still threat to take on c6, so that's why black exchanged. And now precise play from Caruana. He could, if white plays pawn takes knight, then perhaps the queen will blockade. but queen b3 check first, and only then taking on e5. And now you can see there's no blockade on e6, and that pawn is ready to roll forward. Again, just look at this centralization from white. It's so powerful. And black's forces are just completely split here. I mean, this rook never really comes into the game. So let's see how things just wound up. Turns out that Caruana's king is actually completely safe on the queen side, because all the play has been in the middle, and now this pawn is just forced through. So no wasting time moving that rook. So the bishop comes to threaten, and a check, again powering through. The queen blocks, and now rook e6. And with this pawn on e7, black is clearly lost. Black's rooks simply can't defend. Now, Tomashevsky tries a little diversion on the queen side, but Caruana is very cool here. He doesn't mind falling into this pin, but he knows that black can do nothing here. Okay, Tomashevsky now just gives up a piece with bishop takes. If he doesn't, then Caruana would simply step out of the pin, take on a8, and then the pawn goes through to queen. So really Tomashevsky had to give up that piece, but of course now he's completely lost. And let me just go through the final few moves. Caruana steps out of the pin. Well, again, that's a little diversion from Tomashevsky, but it's not effective at all. And in this position, Tomashevsky resigned. He's a piece down, and mate is going to follow. I find it quite fitting that this is the final move of the game. Caruana's pawn advance on the king side is coming good, and it just shows how effective it's been, and that black's king never really found security. A wonderful game. I mean, let me just show you how things might finish. Let's see what happens if the queen goes back to defend against queen g7. Well, we could simply take on c6, and that bishop can't be taken. If rook takes, rook c8 leads to mate, and if queen takes, then rook e6, followed by rook takes rook and queen g7 mate. Caruana on really flying form so far, and I'm going to be going through one of his other wins when I find a bit of time over the next few days. So just to give you a quick overview of this FIDE Grand Prix series, the top 2 players will qualify for the Candidates Tournament in 2016, and the winner of the Candidates will be the next challenger for Magnus Carlsen. So the top 2 go through. Caruana looking good so far. Tomashevsky, if he pulls himself up, he has done so far rather well in the Grand Prix series. He has a chance, but the other player in with a shout is Hikaru Nakamura, but he needs a really good tournament here in Khanty-Mansiysk to catch up. I'll keep you posted with further news.